Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour une nouvelle conférence virtuelle de l'initiative IA et Société. I'm delighted to welcome you today for a new and Society virtual talk. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barito. I am an associate professor of law and the University Research Chair in Technology and Society, as well as the director of the Center for Law, Tech and Society at the University of Ottawa. I'm also the director of the End Society Initiative, multi-center and faculty initiative that is co-presenting this event. And today's virtual event is presented as part of our project on AI for healthy humans and environments, supported by the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue and co-stewarded by three leading Ottawa research groups, the Center for Health, Law, Policy and Ethics, the Center for Law, Technology and Society, and the Institute for Science, Society and Policy. Today's virtual talk will discuss product safety and the regulation of medical devices that are or are using AI and autonomous systems around the work of Dr. Michael Da Silva, who is the Alex Trebek Fellow and Research Associate in AI and Healthcare at the University of Ottawa. It has become a signature of our Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogues and Society event to convene conversation with people from different sectors, offering different perspectives from academia, government, including with people from the innovation sector, from industry. And so for today's conversation, you will also hear from the perspective of an innovator, as well as from the regulators one. And this conversation will be facilitated by my dear colleague, Dr. Colleen Flout, who will tell you a bit more and introduce our speakers and discussant in a few seconds. For those who don't know her, and I'm sure that most people on the call are familiar with Colleen, but Dr. Flout is the University Research Chair in Health Law and Policy at the University of Ottawa and a full professor in the Faculty of Law Common Law section. She's the research lead on AI and health at the AI and Society Initiative. And she's the inaugural director of the Center for Health Law, Policy and Ethics. And without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Colleen.
Merci, Florian. Hi, everybody. Lovely to have you here, and thanks for joining us today. Really excited to host this conversation and really pleased that with the work that we have and are able to do, supported by the Alex Trebek Foundation. So thank you very much. As Florian mentioned, we have three great speakers today. So the primary presentation will be by Michael Da Silva. As Florian mentioned, he's the Alex Trebek Postdoctoral Fellow in AI and Healthcare, and he's a Senior Research Associate for a CIHR-funded research grant that we have called Machine MD. He received his doctorate in law from the University of Toronto, and he has a book coming out very soon on healthcare rights published by the U of T Press. We're super thrilled to also be joined by Marc Lamoureux. He is the manager of the Digital Health Division at Health Canada, where he's worked since 2011. Amongst his many accomplishments, he's the vice chair of Canada's IEC subcommittees for diagnostic imaging and radiotherapy. And he also co-chairs the International Medical Device Regulators Forum Cybersecurity Working Group. You've got to get on top of all these acronyms in this business with the US FDA. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark. Dr. Devin Singh is a practicing pediatric emergency medicine physician at the Hospital for Sick Kids in Toronto. Amongst other roles, he is the physician lead for clinical artificial intelligence and machine learning at Sick Kids for the Division of Emergency Medicine. He recently leveraged his training in computer science, in which he holds a master's, to found Hero AI, and this is an innovative startup lab dedicated to empowering patients and healthcare providers with AI. So we're going to kick off. Michael's going to hold the floor for about 20 minutes, and then we'll go to Mark for 10, and then Devin for 10, or up to 10. I will have to cut you off, gentlemen, if we go on a little bit too long, because we would love to leave some time for questions and dialogue with our participants today. So thank you, all of you in the audience, for taking the time to join us. We know you're all pretty busy. And we really look forward to the conversation that ensues. So, Michael, if we're good to go, that would be wonderful.
All right, thank you. And thank you everyone for hosting me here today. Today, I'm going to be presenting largely on the basis of collaborative work that I've done with Professor Flood and Matthew Herder from Dalhousie University. But since I'm the one on the hot seat, let's operate with the rule that anything good that I say, you can credit to all three of us, and you can blame me for any of the mistakes for the purposes of today at the very least. And so what I want to talk about today is something that might seem obvious to us all, which is that artificial intelligence in healthcare is most likely going to radically transform the Canadian healthcare systems, sectors, and the type of care that patients receive. And this could be for the better. We know that while many are very proud of the Canadian healthcare system for good reason, there's also serious problems that exist in our healthcare sectors. These include the high rates of provider errors causing injury, long wait times that continue to lead to different types of legal challenges, and various forms of discrimination in the healthcare sector, whether they be explicit or oftentimes implicit. And the use of AI in healthcare can, I think, at least help address some of these known problems. So for instance, I have some different pictures on the screen here. If you look at these chest x-rays, it looks fine. Human providers do a very good job of reading chest x-rays. But the use of artificial intelligence could lead to more accurate chest x-rays and earlier identification of particular problems. So for instance, a company based out west called One Qubit has a tool called the X-ray, XRAI. People again love acronyms that really could revolutionize care in this area and provide more accurate diagnoses. In addition, from an accuracy perspective, we could also get things further down the stage, the care stage, in terms of actual provision of surgery. So what we have in the corner here is something from the OR Black Box, which is a tool that is being used right now at Unity Health in Toronto that provides advice to doctors in terms of what steps they should be taking, or at least this is the goal, what steps they should be taking during surgery to provide better treatment to patients. If these tools are leveraged correctly, we could have more accurate care and less injury in care in particular. We could also have increased efficiency that could help deal with some of our wait time issues and give doctors more time to spend on difficult cases. So for instance, Dr. Singh has a very exciting triage tool, he may talk to us later, that can use AI to tell somebody in any waiting room whether it's likely that they actually need to see a doctor or not, or can actually go home because the problem is not as bad as it seems at face value. This will save a lot of people time in waiting rooms and will move the queue forward more quickly. We could also see greater patient autonomy, of course. Think of the use of AI in an insulin pump. Think of the various wellness apps that we have in the sector. Although I had not talked about it earlier, another concern that some people have is various forms of paternalism that may occur in the healthcare setting. AI can help address some of these, while at the same time, I think allowing for more compassionate care that doctors are allowed to give by giving them what Eric Topol calls the gift of time. If we have more efficient, more accurate care, providers will be able to spend more time with the patients who truly need it. So there's a lot of positive transformative potential that many people have discussed. But at the same time as we recognize this vast transformative potential, we must also, I think, attend to some of these risks, which many people have spilled ink and breath upon, but which are very important to keep in mind. These include issues surrounding safety that we cannot easily address due to black box issues or various other forms of explainability concerns. So if we have AI become the standard of care and it makes a lot of errors, it won't just be in some, at least for more autonomous forms of AI, it won't just be a single provider whose error is taking place, but will create harms across the system. And this is a bad thing, I think we can all agree. But even if we don't get to that stage, we have another concern in terms of the fact that just many risks are not foreseeable ex ante. And if we can't understand the more black box or difficult to explain AI tools, it will be hard to identify problems and even harder to fix them when they come about. There's also concerns about perhaps automation bias, doctors relying too heavily on these AI tools, and these can also create safety problems. Concerns about liability gaps, who should be responsible when a AI tool makes the types of decision that I was talking about. Is it reasonable to hold a provider liable for following or not following an AI involved recommendation, for instance, and harm results? There's also, of course, concerns about privacy. A lot of the AI tools require a lot of data. The more data that we collect, the greater the risk that even de-identification might not protect our privacy, because uh, the more data we collect, there's a greater risk of re-identification. But also there's concerns about what it is that we're actually consenting to, even in cases where we do consent to have our privacy taken. And there's concerns about third-party use of data for other uses. So for instance, knowledge that is fed into an AI system might be used to make decisions about what type of insurance I'm going to raise. And this could have spillover effects on the final issue I want to flag, which is this concern about algorithmic bias. Even if we set aside, which I don't think we should, these concerns about the broader social issues that privacy violations can bring about, the risk of algorithmic bias in healthcare presents real problems. For one thing, if we have biased AI tools being used in the healthcare sector, we're actually no longer going to have one of the motivating reasons to use AI in the healthcare sector in the first place. I noted earlier that one of the good things this can do is minimize the implicit and explicit biases already in the system. But if artificial intelligence is, for instance, trained on data that only represents certain populations, think of historical use on cardiac risk being based on men, and we build an AI system on that problematic data, it's not going to fix the problem. We're going to have an AI tool that, again, only works for men. This could make problems worse. It could also it could also lead to a situation where only certain populations are able to benefit from AI. So if we're getting these really great tools, but they only work for people who are white males, only certain people are going to get all those great benefits I was talking about earlier. And those are societal problems we need to worry about. But there's also a safety issue here, which is just if a tool is designed for a person with characteristics X, there's real concerns that it might not work for people with characteristic Y. What I think, and what I think I can at least get agreement with my co-authors on this point, is that whether we have this massive potential for good be realized, or the concern, or have the risks be realized, is at least in part a function of the legal regulations that are in place to address the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare. And so the question that I've been posing along with many colleagues recently is, in short, this: are Canadian laws up to the task of ensuring Canadians can benefit from effective health-related AI while minimizing AI-related risks? In order to answer that question, we need to address the whole ecosystem of laws that apply to AI in healthcare. This includes federal and provincial laws and regulations. This includes the common law. This includes a variety of professional codes of conduct and ethical codes. But for the purpose of this paper, what I've decided to do with my colleagues is to focus on what you might call the first line of defense in ensuring that only safe, effective AI gets on the market, which is the federal regulation of medical devices. And in particular, Health Canada's review of medical devices to ensure that only safe and effective medical devices make it onto the market. And I focus in particular on safety issues, since this is what is specifically within the jurisdiction of Health Canada to address. Although when I discuss safety, I also address concerns about algorithmic bias for the very reasons I just discussed. Bias can have spillover effects on safety. In addressing these concerns, I take reasonably basic definitions of the terms. When I talk about artificial intelligence, I use a definition where I say that it's the use of computer systems to perform tasks traditionally requiring human cognition without direct human intervention. So what I'm talking about here is the type of computer program or tool that after I set it up to operate in a certain way, no longer requires me to keep going back in order for it to do the type of thing that a human would otherwise do. Machine learning for my purposes is AI that collects new inputs through its operation and adapts to new data to provide hopefully improved outcomes. So in the real world, it will see what's happening, and it will be able to actually change in light of new data that's being fed into it, as opposed to just being sort of an automated tool. And when I talk about a medical device, I just use the statutory definition of the term, which is in effect any instrument, et cetera, that we can use in diagnosis, treatment, mitigation, prevention. When we're talking, this is a technical definition here, but what we're talking about is the wide variety of different tools that we use in healthcare for medical purposes. And these include everything from a Band-Aid, although I don't see any AI Band-Aids coming up the pipeline, to a pacemaker. And what's important to note, I think, is that statutorily, anything that meets this definition and is going to be regulated, even if it consists of or contains software. So something no longer needs to just be hardware in order to be regulated, so long as it meets this statutory definition. These definitions are of course subject of great controversy, but they're the ones we'll work with today. And when we talk about federal regulation of medical devices for safety and efficacy in particular, what we're predominantly talking about is regulations under the Food and Drug Act, which is a federal act, and the medical devices regulations issued pursuant to it. These tools establish two main factors. One, explicit requirements relating to the safety and efficacy of products and misleading labeling and advertising. And these rules set up certain rules certain conditions that people trading in medical devices need to meet, as well as certain penalties for failing to meet those conditions, as well as a manufacturing, importation, and distribution licensing scheme, such that if you want to trade in medical devices or and use medical devices commercially, you need to have certain licenses or face the penalties for that I've just mentioned a moment ago. Now, what's notable is I just mentioned the word use, but technically these rules only apply to the sale of medical devices, which requires some commercial element. So what we're really talking about here is only commercial uses of medical devices. There's a small carve out in the rules with respect to clinical trials involving humans. I'm not going to focus on them today, but it's worth noting. But what this does mean is that if you are using or developing a tool only for in-house use in a particular sector for non-commercial purposes, it's not going to be regulated. There are many rules in the Food and Drug Acts and the medical device regulations. If you want to learn a lot about them, I'm actually teaching a course on this next term, so at least the law students on the call can learn a lot more about AI, the rules pertaining to AI and medical devices, the law and ethics of AI. But I'm going to focus here on some basic points that I think we need to keep in mind moving forward, which is that the Food and Drug Acts and medical devices regulations establish both pre-market and post-market considerations that those who trade in medical devices need to meet. At the pre-market stage, a lot of the work is done in terms of licensing, and a lot of the work is done in terms of establishing what license you require to trade in medical devices and what you need to provide to get it. And so what license you will require and what you need to get it is a function of the risk of the device that you are putting forward. So with class 1 being the lowest level and class 4 being the highest level. If as you move up the higher levels of classification, you are subject to further rules and you are required to provide more information in order to receive your licenses. But what's notable are two things. One, risk categories are largely self-selected. Health Canada can review the decision that you make, and you do need to establish why it is that you've selected the class, or you will face a reclassification. And secondly, it's worth noting that the level of evidence that you require only really rises to the level of positive evidence when you reach class 3 of the tools. Prior to that, you only need to provide an attestation that objective evidence of effectiveness exists. Now, this is, I think, notable because many AI tools will end up falling into class 2. Now, it's one thing that we've seen in the guidance document is that any closed loop system, this is an AI system that does not have a provider involved in its use at all, is going to get into class 4. So we are going to have high evidentiary standards at that level. But what we also see that is that any active diagnostic devices used for imaging or monitoring physiological processes are going to fit in level 2. So we're not going to get a lot of the evidence we might desire for these tools. I don't want to overstate this point. It is the case that we will get some information provision on studies through the requirement to get a quality management certificate. But it's, I think, focusing on these requirements is notable. We also have various forms of post-market analysis, second, that include quality management certificates requiring that you submit to audits. We see Health Canada hire inspectors of manufacturing processes, and they can now order safety and long-term safety and efficacy reports. We also know that manufacturers, importers, and hospitals must report incidents with medical devices. However, it's worth noting that long-term care homes, private clinics, and healthcare providers are not yet subject to these requirements. Okay, but what does any of that have to do with AI, you might be wondering? Well, what we see right now is that for locked ML, and other forms of artificial intelligence, that is artificial intelligence that does not adapt to real world evidence and change how it's going to operate over time, all can be licensed under the terms of the rules that I was just talking about. And notably, it can do that even when it's not part of hardware. However, it's also worth noting that the focus on sale might not capture all uses of AI. We're at a point in the sector where a lot of AI tools are only being used for in-house purposes within hospitals. And so we might actually get a lot of them not being actually regulated. And we've also seen that Health Canada has indicated it will not regulate certain kinds of AI tools. So they have guidance document on software as a medical device, which is a category that includes certain forms of AI and explains how it is that these rules apply to software in particular. But one thing that we see in those guidance is that there are when certain conditions apply, namely where there's no attempt to replace clinical judgment and we're only analyzing medical images, medical information and not medical images, we're actually not going to regulate them as software as a medical device. So what we might end up with is many forms of AI currently on the market practically escaping regulatory review. Well, we also see,
Michael,
however,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are getting close to what the assigned time. So, and we're so I'm noticing we're not quite getting through the material. So perhaps we could just go for another 10 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
get
think
to
I was misinformed about the amount of time I had. Certainly my mistake on the timeline, but okay. Sorry.
No,
I thought I thought I still had like 7 minutes. Okay. It's
okay.
fine.
Well, that's fine. We can certainly give you 7 minutes. How about we give you 10 minutes and we'll go,
Okay,
and we'll try
perfect.
to.
And so what this ends up, where we end, what we also see is that, interestingly, adaptive machine learning is in effect, is almost impossible to actually get regulated. And this is because under the rules that I just discussed, you need to actually attest that your tool will perform as intended. And you need to, for class 3 and class 4 at least, you need to actually validate the performance in advance. But this is impossible with adaptive machine learning since by definition, we cannot know how it's going to change over time. And so we have these variety of issues I've been just talking. So when we look at all these things, we see a variety of different issues. We see concerns about being able to select your own risk category and being able playing a large role in your provision of post-market information. And what we also see is, interestingly, not a lot of discussion explicitly about the need to attend to bias or privacy concerns. We also see that certain forms of machine learning and AI are able to escape regulatory scrutiny, while at the same time, some that could be really, really helpful are actually unable to make it onto the market at all. So we're not reaching that balance of getting the good stuff on while ensuring that we get the best possible analysis of the worst cases that could come forward. So what's exciting is that we have right now, Health Canada has been given the power to create actually bespoke regulatory pathways for what they call advanced therapeutic products. And these are products that do not yet do not actually fit the regulatory requirements well. And where they're starting things is actually with adaptive machine learning on the understanding that it does raise these unique concerns that we've been addressing previously. Marc's playing a large role on this, and I think it's really exciting. If we do this right, we will be able to create regulations that are going to ensure only good materials get on while avoiding the risk. But a lot of the devil is going to be in the details. And so what I do in the paper, along with Matthew and Colleen, is address some high-level principles we think should guide this. And let me spend 5 minutes on what we think some of those principles ought to be. One is the need for strong, independent review. There is, of course, a long-standing concerns about regulatory capture in any industry. That is that over time, any regulator will start to be more interested in the concerns of the regulator rather than the public. It is important that we have strong independent review in order to avoid even the appearance of this kind of capture, and that we ensure that Health Canada is actually using its powers to ensure that the regulated are actually meeting all the proper requirements. So one way that we can address some of these potential perceptions of capture would be to provide the public with data on how enforcement is taking place. And if we see that there is widespread enforcement of the rules, then closer relationships with industry and the development of the rule might be less problematic. However, whatever role that industry does play in the development of these rules, we need to ensure that the concerns with innovation never take a backseat to safety, and any conflicts between them are resolved in favor of safety. Secondly, we discussed the need for stringent lifecycle regulation. Given that at least adaptive machine learning changes over time, it's clear that ex-ante licensing alone is going to be insufficient for addressing the relevant concerns. So we need post-market review, but it should not come at the expense of fulsome pre-market review. We need to ensure that we don't trade off post-market review for pre-market review. And in some ways, some of the things I can talk about in the question period that we're seeing in the US in the FDA setting raises red flags I hope Health Canada will not follow. We, in fact, may need more pre-market review in this setting, given the limited data on product efficiency that we have. There is, I think, real needs to establish what it means, and this can get us to our third point here, what it means for a product to meet standards of safety and efficacy. And at a point where a lot of AI tools are still in clinical development, I think there's a real need to have the regulators have enough information in order to transparently set the standards so that we all know what the rules are. And one way that we can do this that is worth considering both for its pre-market benefits and for its transparent standard setting benefits would be an interim rule requiring randomized control trials on adaptive machine-enabled devices in particular. We could then use these randomized trial as a database for monitoring and monitoring safety and efficacy over time, and therefore set standards on which we can all agree. And then the last thing I'll say in my final minute is that I think we do need to have explicit considerations of how safety and efficacy interacts with bias interacts with safety, and we need to attend to that in the safety and efficacy reviews. I have no doubt that Health Canada is addressing some of these concerns at present, and I was happy to see that the good machine learning practices actually requires attending to that people attend to this in order to meet certain best practice guidelines. I would love to see this be explicitly required over time. What we need at the end of the day is clear rules that attend to AI's unique challenges. This need not require undue red tape, but it does require stringent life cycle review with an independent regulator who will act transparently and address bias and privacy. I think the ATP is a great opportunity in this respect. I thank you very much for bearing with me. I apologize for going a little long. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Michael. And sorry to rush you along at the end. I just thought that we would want to make sure we had time for our other panelists and some Q&A. There's some stuff happening in the chat already, and we're sort of doing Q&A as we go along as well. But if you do have questions or comments, pop them in the chat and we'll get to them. Marc, I thought we'd turn to you to comment on Michael set up the discussion around the ATP pathway, and I'm sure that many on the call would love to hear more about this new prospect and how you see it unfolding.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm gonna I'll spend maybe 5-7 minutes or so, maybe setting up what we do kind of day to day, and then move on to sort of this new pathway that Michael had referred to. So before I do that, I want to express my huge thanks to the organizers for having me. It's a real pleasure. And in addition, I'd like to comment that Michael, you did an excellent job on the talk. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marc Lamoureux. I manage the digital health division within the Medical Devices Directorate at Health Canada, and I lead a team of physicists and engineers and software experts in sort of pre-market evaluation of medical devices, including digital health tools, not only software-only tools, but hardware and software tools as well. AI and machine learning is something that Health Canada has been extremely active on, both domestically as well as internationally. On the international front, we're actively participating in regulators forums that essentially get all the jurisdictional bodies together and work on harmonization efforts. And in fact, we're actively involved in an AI group right now. We're also involved in the WHO level, so AI for Health focus group, specifically on the regulatory considerations in this field. And I even lead a technical delegation to the G7 on AI governance, on sort of minimum clinical evidence requirements and benchmarking between jurisdictions. So we're very active on this front. And in fact, actually, just a couple of weeks ago, we issued a joint statement with the FDA and the UK's MHRA in good machine learning practices, sort of a joint effort for the need for good practice for AI developers in healthcare. And I mean, and I think that sort of just sets a baseline for what developers should sort of include. And really, that really showed Canada's kind of on the leading edge of this field, I believe, in AI regulation. It shows some international harmonization, which is excellent, and really harmonization, but also validation that what we're doing in Canada really is aligned and endorsed by other major jurisdictions. So getting to the last point on Michael's slides with regards to the ATP update, forgive Colleen joked that government's full of acronyms. So that is sort of the Advanced Therapeutic Products Pathway. Michael did an excellent job in setting that up, and that's essentially a novel regulatory pathway that we're currently working on. It's definitely not final yet. We still need to get some policy directions on a few fronts, but this is something that it was built not for AI. It was actually built for innovative health products, whether or not it's biologic or a drug or a device, where they didn't necessarily fit our current regulatory framework. So this was an idea from many years ago, was to develop this extra pathway that could perhaps capture some of those emerging technologies, and we had proposed that AI might fit through that pathway. And this is not regulation. This is governance straight from the Act, where we would essentially work with stakeholders in developing a framework that fits. Once that machine is well oiled and we have appropriate regulatory oversight, the lessons learned in this sort of, we used to call it a sandbox, lessons learned in this environment would then be transferred over into regulation and perhaps legislative amendments. So when we talk about adaptive machine learning, this is something that it varies over time. As a regulator, you can probably appreciate that's impossible to regulate. It's something that changes. If your pill that you take, that prescription pill that changes between today and tomorrow, how is a regulator supposed to determine whether or not it's safe tomorrow? So we've actually not authorized anything that has been described as adaptive to us. We essentially require manufacturers to lock down their algorithms. So if we're talking about terms and definitions, we authorize machine learned algorithms. And so I'm proud to state that we're involved in this advanced therapeutic product pathway. And very briefly, in this proposed model for machine learning or adaptive machine learning, we want to innovate. We want to look at what our regulations state that were written in the late 90s, and perhaps build on some of the pain points that are gaps that we've seen. So I think Michael did an excellent job in identifying some gaps. Our proposal is essentially based on the FDA's proposal for regulating adaptive machine learning, and it's essentially, we maintain oversight on the company's ability to make a good algorithm. That's something that we don't typically weigh into at this point. We just assume that they have a quality management certificate. Sorry, I shouldn't say assume. That we expect evidence, certified evidence, that they have a management system. We'd also pre-approve a future state of the product. That's something that is new to medical devices, and we'd enhance our sort of monitoring in the post-market world. So if the manufacturer stays within their pre-approved design, that we'd have our technical teams assess their pre-approved design, and they stay within that envelope, that's great. They can proceed to deploying that to the user, and we would essentially maintain oversight on that life cycle. If major changes are to be made that we weren't aware of at the beginning, no problem. They come in for standard reauthorization just like they do today. And these concepts have actually been enacted in legislation in Japan and are being discussed at the FDA and other international fora as well. And we work very closely with our counterparts as well. And our vision for here is really to foster access, promote innovation, test new concepts, because our regulations do have some gaps, align internationally, but not at the expense of protecting the health and safety of Canadians. I think that is paramount to a lot of our decisions. We make the analogy to the Nexus card sometimes. For those of you who have or know about the Nexus card, right? There's a little bit of work up front for the applicant to gain trust by the authorities, to get a little bit more information, so that border crossing between the U.S. and Canada are a little bit more efficient. But the benefactors of these sort of efficient border crossings, if you will, would be Canadian patients. So we rely heavily on stakeholder engagement. I won't necessarily spend, I will definitely answer questions to it, but our intention is to actively involve clinicians, patients, health technology assessment bodies, government partners, provincial partners as well, territorial partners, as well as our huge Canadian AI strength here in academia and innovation hubs. We have a really, really good opportunity here in Canada to lean heavily on our AI hubs. And finally, maybe I'll just close on some points that really resonated with me that Michael had presented in terms of pre-market review of perhaps products that are a little bit lower risk that Michael had mentioned about the Class 2 framework. And manufacturers don't necessarily need to apply with data; they just simply need to have it, and we would just investigate if necessary. One thing that our digital health team took sort of initiative on was, in fact, to develop a process in which we actively screen for AI products in this Class 2 pipeline, and in fact stop market access before we take, and then we'll be able to take a quick look at it. Our technical team would do that. That's something that we have identified a need for, and although the regulations don't necessarily provide us with that routine ability, we definitely take the initiative to do that. Data representation is super big. So number one is Class 2 products. Number two, data representativeness. That is something that we are aware of and are definitely working on. And we've got some real strong collaborations, both internationally and nationally, on that topic. And that's something that actually the G7 is working on right now. If let's say the UK authorizes a product to be safe on their population, how can we then take that foreign decision and somehow apply it to our Canadian population? Not to say that is the end goal, but that's something that we're talking about. And in addition, we're also leaning to our clinical counterparts as well, the Canadian Association of Radiologists. We're working with them to develop a national validation network where we can take a solution, have the clinicians use the solution in a clinical environment, and give us feedback on how it is or is not working. A couple other points, and I'll be very brief on another minute or so. The manufacturers choosing their own risk category, that's something, our position that we have taken, simply to avoid being a service, but by no means do we allow manufacturers to choose their own risk category. They essentially just come in with a proposal, and if we agree with that proposal, that is fine. If they come in and we disagree, we ask them to change their risk category. So that's a hard stop that we have internally. Randomized controlled trials for every solution. This is something that would be extremely difficult, both from an innovator's perspective as well as a regulator's perspective, in the sense of the number of decisions we make. My team, and there's six teams like mine, make about 500 decisions a year. That's at Class 3 and Class 4 levels. Class 2s, the medical devices group is making about 10,000 decisions a year. However, so while that might be a little bit troubling in requesting an RCT or a randomized controlled trial for every decision, we're hoping to take that great concept and use that in the advanced therapeutic product pathway to monitor the performance of a lot of these solutions in a real world setting, and then get feedback from that, right? So while the terms that we use may be different, randomized controlled trial versus real world evidence, I think that's some commonality here. So thank you for the opportunity for me to comment. I'm happy to discuss any questions or concerns after. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark, and it's really informative and super helpful. So we'll turn it to Devin, and then we will get to your questions in the audience. Thank you for your patience. Devin.
Perfect. Thanks, Colleen, Michael, and Mark. Michael, great job on sort of setting the stage here. That was wonderful and really important questions to address. And then Mark, thank you for clarifying a lot of the different points as well. What I want to do here, and I mean, I could talk for hours on this, as Mark knows, actually, in some of our committee meetings. So I'm going to try and be really concise, but break up my points of view into three broad perspectives. One around a clinical provider perspective, one on what I feel may be a patient perspective, just from my interactions with patients on the topic, but certainly I'm not, I would never say I'm an official representation of the patient voice. And then two, an innovator's perspective as we're breaking out into this field. And one of the key points that Michael had talked about, which resonates really well for me from a healthcare provider, emergency doctor, and I think from a patient perspective, is around safety, right? And that certainly patient safety and the maintenance of patient safety and the preservation of that for the Canadian public is really the goal of what we're trying to achieve here. But then how do we achieve that without adding unnecessary burdens that might stifle innovation in our Canadian landscape? Because innovation will lead to improved patient safety as well, right? And innovation will lead to improved patient outcomes. So there's this like dichotomous struggle here that Health Canada has an incredibly challenging task with trying to mitigate and solve, especially when it comes to adaptive AI, which I'll circle back to. But from the clinical perspective, I want to raise a very quick use case around something that we're doing at SickKids. We're trying to leverage triage data from patients who come into our emergency department to actually understand what might be the down care needs that a patient will need. So for example, let's say you have got a kiddo or you yourself, you fall off your bike, you have a lot of wrist pain. I'll tell you, everyone knows at the time of triage, even the 8-year-old kid who this happens to when he or she falls off her bike, they all know they need an x-ray of their wrist, right? But they're gonna go through this triage process and then this wait time, 4 to 6 hours in an emergency department, waiting for then a healthcare provider like myself, or maybe a medical student or resident, to see that patient and then say, oh yeah, you need an x-ray. Like, we all knew this. And so we wondered, could we actually use data at the time of triage to make these downstream predictions? And it turns out you can, actually. We can use machine learning to predict things like needs for x-ray, ultrasound, urine testing, ECGs, right? But then, yes, we can validate that statistically, but it raises this whole set of questions now on, is it, one, ethically right, but two, is there a legal framework to allow us to deploy an AI solution into a healthcare workflow that's provisioning care and diagnostic imaging tests for a child without any real human in the loop authorizing that decision? Could that be done autonomously, right? And if so, what framework currently exists to do that? And my intersection with Colleen and Mark and Michael comes from this project and me seeking out answers for that, actually, and wondering, well, what is safe enough, right? Who defines what's good enough and what's not? Here are the outcome metrics of the model, validated statistically, but is that good enough? And that's a complicated answer that I think we're going to come up to in the discussion, but also around looking at the regulatory landscape. Do I need to actually do bias assessments, for example? And from an academic perspective, and even from an innovator perspective, I think bias assessments are really important, right? This gives you an idea of how will your model generalize and perform out to different subpopulations in the world. This is essential, right? I think both innovators and healthcare practitioners want to build solutions that actually improve patient care and not inadvertently discriminate against patients or cause harm. And so in order to do that, you need a bias assessment, but this becomes incredibly difficult because in our Canadian healthcare landscape, the practice of collecting ethnicity data or racial data isn't commonly done. At SickKids, we're working on putting that into place, but it's certainly not the standard. And so when I build these models, I have to use surrogate markers like postal code or like maybe their preferred language of speech. But these things, some people will even use last name, right? But these things don't actually align to someone's identifiable ethnicity and race. And so we have a discrepancy here between a bar that we want to set which is to do thorough bias assessments, understand what is safe and who is it safe for, but then we miss the data, and there's a lack of data to actually enable either an academic innovator or even an industry innovator to meet those bars. And so that creates a bit of a dilemma here that we need to think through, right? There's also this idea around when we deploy autonomous like solutions, who is responsible? And so Michael brought up this, this idea around when a model makes a mistake, in a medical legal framework, who's responsible for that error? Like, who owns that, right? Is it the patient for consenting to allow their data to be used through that model, and they should have been informed and aware of the risks, pros and cons? Is it the healthcare institution that actually purchases this model from an industry, and they should have had it vetted in the right way with safety nets in place? Is it the industry provider who actually made the model and sold it to a healthcare institution or to a patient? Like, where does the liability fall to? And that's certainly a question that's unanswered for me as an innovator and a practitioner in the space, and not unanswered in a bad way, but to say that it's complicated. And I think it's really exciting to see groups of people like these prominent lawyers and regulators and someone like me, an innovator on the ground, working together to try and mitigate what is the best practice for it. So I think that's really interesting. Certainly from a safety perspective with respect to patients, and when I bring some of our innovations to patient working groups at SickKids, I hear things coming back, and surprisingly, the first thing I hear coming back isn't around their data privacy, but I actually think that data privacy is a topic that the patients are concerned about, but they assume when they're interacting with an institution like SickKids, that's like an assumption that, of course, data governance and data privacy will be maintained. So that usually doesn't come up first, but I do hear a lot about transparency. And by transparency, I mean that patients, through my interactions, seem to want to know when an AI model is informing a decision and when it's not. And this right to understanding how their care is being influenced, and the sort of dance between decision support, autonomous care, and human provider, for that to be transparent to patients, so that they know, let's say our model autonomously ordered an X-ray for a kiddo, what would functionally happen is a nurse would then approach that patient and say, oh, we're taking you to X-ray now. But you could see how there's risk for a lack of transparency for that patient or that parent to know that, oh, it was actually a machine learning algorithm that made that order for them. So patients want transparency, and they also want to ensure that technology doesn't replace the quality and the amount of human-to-human care and interaction that's received. But this is an interesting conversation that's arisen around wanting to speed things up and leverage technology to get through workflows faster, but goes back to this point that Michael made around, well, can AI actually add efficiencies in ways that humans can actually have more time to interact with the patients they need to in more meaningful ways? And I think if the balance is done right, we can see that happen. But pivoting back to the regulatory landscape, how do you then bring this into a particular process or a procedure that's formal and that actually then governs how all of this AI innovation gets off the ground? It becomes quite nuanced. And an innovator may instinctively react to more regulatory procedures as being a barrier to innovation, potentially. My personal view, though, is I think that added regulatory clarity, which actually comes from different procedures, may actually start to streamline innovation, in that removing the uncertainty around AI, adaptive AI, and how to move forward, and knowing that there's a clear path, I suppose, would actually add clarity to a process that de-risks things from the innovator perspective. You kind of know what you're getting into when you're trying to build out a new product or a new algorithm and bring it to market. This is the way forward. It's clear. You can properly assign risk and cost and timelines, and then blitz for it. I think that we may actually see more excitement and enthusiasm in that regulatory space, and more things coming to market as a result of that. But certainly, especially around the topic of adaptive AI, and I'll end here because I see there's a lot of chatter in the chat there that's really useful. This idea of adaptive AI, I think, is really interesting because, in my opinion and from my experience, the models that we've built, they do need to retrain. And it actually can be more detrimental or dangerous to have a model that remains static and locked, because performance does start to decline. It's a technical thing that happens. The performance will start to decline because there are these changes in the environment and in the real world that if you lock a machine learning model, it's now not continuously learning and adapting to those changes like how we as human providers would change and adapt. And so there is a risk point here where we're sort of putting industry into this locked machine learning model framework. And really, some of these ideal models should be adaptive. They might actually be safer and perform better if made adaptive. And so I think Health Canada recognizes that really well, and working with lots of committees. And I've been inspired by the effort that Marc and his team has put forward in trying to solve for this so that we can deploy adaptive AI. But I just want to make that point there that adaptive doesn't always mean more risky. If anything, sometimes it can be the other way around. We need to, there's sort of like the sense of urgency, I think, around solving for that, because I really believe machine learning models will be more effective in the healthcare landscape, will be safer if allowed to be adaptive. And I'll pause there and throw it back over to you, Colleen.
Okay, thank you so much, Devin, and thank you again, Marc and Michael. There's been a bit of commentary in the chat, and so as people have more questions, please pop them in there and I will do my best to get to them. So I think just to sum up a few questions that have come through from Luke and others have been around, I guess, the sort of optimism bias towards AI and what it can do in healthcare. And related to that question, I think, is how does one actually define safety? So perhaps, you know, and I think that's a reasonable concern, is that we have, you know, Devin, you sort of said innovation will result in patient safety, but being a lawyer, I would say some innovation may result in patient safety. There's not a direct pipeline between those two things, and that the goal of the regulatory framework must be to weed out the bad and propel the good. But of course, the question is, how do you define the good? So, Marc, I wondered, could you speak a little bit to the definition of safety, perhaps that you currently work with for medical devices, and how you see that for health-related AI, particularly adaptive machine learning? Is that a reasonable question?
Absolutely, and it's really just a window into kind of our day-to-day operations, you know, and this type of discussion isn't even exclusive to AI. This, you know, if we start talking about perhaps maybe the harms associated with privacy, this isn't an AI problem, right? So I think maybe what I'd start off with is that, you know, Health Canada has the responsibility to administer regulations that are very broad. That the product needs to be safe, it needs to be effective, right? So and that definition of safety, as we've understood it and interpreted, is essentially harm to the patient or harm to users or patients. So this comes down to biological safety. I'm smiling only because it's so broad. Biological safety, whether or not your fingers get pinched on a CT scanner when the bed is going in and out, right? Electrical safety, you name it, right? There's just safety in general. Sometimes there are safety standards that manufacturers need to meet. Obviously, in emerging tech like this, the standards just aren't there yet. So when we talk about safety, we talk about patient harm and operator harm. We have dipped our toe in that discussion around, well, what does harm mean when it's perhaps maybe psychological harm? We are having those discussions. No formal positions have been put down. But I did want to highlight one thing, and Colleen, you made a great point, is sort of weeding the good and the bad. And it's actually our technical teams, our recommendations as a regulator are not is this safe or not? Yes or no. But in fact, do the benefits outweigh the risks, right? That is our bottom line. So there might be devices that we authorize that are extremely risky. However, both our technical teams as well as our clinical teams, we have physicians on staff to then help us understand and characterize the benefits versus risk. So yes, safety is critical. Benefit over risk is also critical as well. But I'm happy, and it's very challenging. It's to define that, because it's a combination. It's not a checklist. It's a combination of subject matter experts, clinical experts, safety standards, as well as identified risks, and the developers or the innovators or the manufacturers, call them what you will, the controls for those risks, and whether or not they've convinced us that they've controlled it enough such that the benefits outweigh the risks.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Devin or Michael, did you want to comment on that at all?
Can I just build off of that? Because I think it's an important question, that safety also really depends on the use case, on how you're going to actually leverage this tool, right? And so, for example, I propose this idea of models automating the ordering of tests, right? If that was actually used as a decision support where another human is looped in, can critically think about the process and then actually confirm an order, that becomes a more safe scenario. And then maybe the outcome metrics for that model with respect to the number of false positives, false negatives, true positives, et cetera, the statistics around the model, you might have a bit more leniency. There was a comment in the chat around, statistical validation and a plus minus error bar sort of window. And, you can envision how, if used in that scenario, you may allow for a higher margin of error in the model, because really this is about prompting a human to think critically about a solution. However, if a model is then going to autonomously provision and order a test for a patient without a human in the loop, you can imagine that window and the way that I would imagine Health Canada would critically think about something would be much more rigorous. But that definition of, how many false positive X-rays are okay in a year, given the number of true positive X-rays, with the idea of we're adding this much efficiency to an emergency department or a health system, therefore we may actually improve care for many other people who aren't even using the model, right? That's a complicated thing to answer. There's layers of ethics, medical legal, and certainly patient perspectives, I think, need to be really brought into this conversation to understand what are their opinions of these types of autonomously acting solutions. So I just raised that. There's a lot of stakeholders involved, and it really depends on the use case and how something's being deployed.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I build on that or no? You want to go?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, no, so this is all really interesting stuff. I mean, one thing to talk about with the use cases that makes it difficult is that from a regulatory perspective, we're not, broadly speaking, actually going all the way down to use, right? So we will, when classifying what risk category you fit into, intended use will play a role in that, right? And so what you can say is, okay, this model is only going to be used for this kind of use case, therefore it falls into this class. But what we can't do in this set of regulations as they presently exist is sort of tailor them such that it will have something that could work on two ways. Put it through one pathway. It's really hard to stop other forms of use, and off-label use is, I think, a concern we have to have in the background here. As well. I had spoken earlier about this discussion of sale. I mean, I think when we start to think about use cases, it does also bring us back to the way in which how machine learning is used might be something that we need to attend to. And the ATP actually allows us to regulate use in some ways, and that might be something worth exploring. The only other thing I wanted to respond to is the statistical questions are fascinating. There's questions about statistically, what do we require for safety. There was an excellent paper at a Younger Scholars workshop on Friday that was raising questions about what statistical level of bias should we be willing to accept and how do we weigh that against a statistical level of efficiency when we're doing our benefit and risk calculations. These are really important questions. I think this paper is a step step before that, which just says, let's make this explicitly part of our calculus. A lot of what Marc says, it's like, yeah, it's great that you do that. But if we had a law that said that that was explicitly required, so that if I always like to prepare for the worst case. If we had regulators who weren't as attentive as the ones we had now, we would still know that they were making those types of hard judgment, and then they'll have to decide what those numbers are going to be in collaboration with all the stakeholders you were just discussing.
Thank you, Michael. So the way that I understand the FDA process, and please correct if this isn't right, Marc, but the idea is to sort of certify the provider, the innovator, as being reputable, like you said, the sort of pass to get through the airport super fast. Is this, and that is because of the difficulty of monitoring what will happen subsequently. So is that the idea of it? Is that the innovator itself will have a sort of proven track record, and this is to compensate for the fact that post-market, it will be difficult to basically be sitting on top of the innovator to know if it is doing, as someone said in the chat, test, sort of making sure that it is working properly all the time. Is that how it will? Is that how it plays, Marc? I just want to make sure we all understand that.
Yeah, and forgive me that I didn't necessarily go into the details on that. So the FDA has sort of proposed two, I would argue, separate initiatives. Many years ago, which is still ongoing. This is the pre-certification pilot program. This is when yes, they would certify the manufacturer, build trust, and allow them access. The other FDA proposal, and Health Canada has not sort of had any sort of initiatives domestically on the pre-certification program, which relates to software and low-risk medical devices. Then the FDA came out in 2019 with a proposal specifically about adaptive machine learning, and that is something that Health Canada has latched onto, and that is the proposal for this advanced therapeutic product pathway, where no, there wouldn't be necessarily a pre-certification of the manufacturer. What we're actually proposing is a little bit more pre-market oversight in the beginning. It would be the ability, so we'd essentially be scoring the manufacturer on their ability to make a good product using good machine learning practices and all the rest. As well as making them outline their policies, procedures, and future state of the product. So I would argue that we'd be asking them for more upfront than we currently do, with the trade-off of them not coming in for regulatory authorizations every time the performance of that product changes. So currently, and forgive me, I didn't really highlight that. Really, the driving factor here, one of many, is the fact that every time a performance algorithm, the performance of an algorithm changes. So in Devin's scenario, the sensitivity of a particular test changes. Well, in our current form, that manufacturer would have to apply to Health Canada and get authorization for that performance change. That's probably about a 3 to 10 month process for one update, right? So what we want to do is essentially have proper oversight on that updating procedure, but we're asking manufacturers to do a little bit more work ahead of time to demonstrate to us that in fact they have the appropriate provisions in place to update that. So sorry for the long-winded answer. It's not pre-certifying the manufacturer ahead of time. It's actually front-loading a lot of the work that we're asking them to do. We'll look at it once, agree to a design envelope, And as long as they operate within that design envelope, we will simply just enhance our monitoring of that product in the post-market.
So just to be clear then, the design envelope will have some thresholds of risk or safety margins where if presumably changes to an extent that there is the risk of harm, will that then have to be reported back to Health Canada? And is that the idea?
So not only reporting, but if they are outside of the design envelope, they need to stop and come back for the normal, rigorous process again. So that's why one of the reasons we're monitoring this post-market way, much more than we are now. So yes, that design envelope is very, very important. Our hope is that manufacturers say, with more data, our performance will only increase, right? That is it's a huge sort of simplifying. I know there are many complexities here where it may change, but our hope is that with exposure to new data, the performance will therefore increase. So we're going to be very careful in approving that design envelope, and absolutely, pragmatically, we're not going to have the performance have an envelope, have a the plus minus, the minus very much different from what we're currently approving, if that made sense. But no, I think your understanding is correct.
Colleen, okay. Can I make a comment to Marc real quick? Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. So Marc, I'm curious. I don't know. I mean to put you on the spot. I'm curious. Like, I love this idea of a design envelope, right? And then allowing an innovator, whoever they may be, within a hospital, within industry, operating, because then you know that they're in the sandbox that's safe. Like we've all deemed it safe. How do you foresee plugging in like bias and ethnicity assessment and generalizability concepts into the envelope? And I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and this is something that, so we would have some level of oversight in the pre-market. So we do this, I want to say daily, in the sense of tell us exactly what you trained on, give us the demographics. This is no different from a drug trial where you see the demographics of the population in a drug trial. What we recognize in this field is that there is a unknown unknown. So what we want to do, and this advanced therapeutic product pathway is a perfect way to do this, is if there is a solution that's developed and trained, let's say in a population, I don't know, upstate New York, do we know if that's generalizable in Canada? No, we don't. We have reasonable assurance that yes, it may, depending on the risk class. Again, to the point that was made earlier, depending on what it's intended for. Is it a decision support software, or there's a physician in the loop that's just monitoring the output? We might be comfortable with that. If it's completely autonomous, how do we know that it's going to be representative in Canada or not? What we want to do is cautiously allow it, perhaps maybe a decision support with that post-market oversight, so that make sure that yes, that is in fact generalizable to the population, and let's say in urban Toronto. And if that's the case, we want that cautious optimism that yes, we can go forward with that, gaining experience as we go, fully acknowledging that there are risk controls in place. Would we allow that in urban Toronto as a totally autonomous solution? No. And I think I saw a comment in the chat about the skepticism of whether or not these tools exist or not. They do, and rest assured, even in the context of COVID, we did not allow certain software solutions, and on the one point that we had no idea if they were generalizable to the Canadian population. We had no evidence of that, therefore we said not at this time, or you need a clinical trial. In this particular scenario, bias, ethnicity, generalizability, this is a perfect example of where we can, as long as we have all the stakeholders watching this, then we can do it in a controlled fashion, right? And have the ability to stop or revert back whenever we wish. And again, this is a learning exercise, right? This is not necessarily regulation at this point. This is simply just a sandbox where responsible stakeholders, and Colleen, to the point that I made earlier about us scoring the manufacturer, their ability to make a good product, we're not going to let anyone just do this. We're going to make sure that the manufacturer is responsible. We have physicians in the loop, and that the appropriate risk controls are in place. So it's a learning exercise for everyone, Devin, and yes, it's challenging.
So I think your last comment there, Mark, and some of Devin's comments raises this question about having the physician or other healthcare provider in the loop, and that being a measure of safety. And I just would like to sort of perhaps press you a bit on that, because as Michael pointed out at the beginning, part of why we want AI is to improve upon arguably very poor safety levels, extant safety levels in the healthcare system, and improve upon iatrogenic physician and nurse and pharmacist error. So is it reasonable, do you think, and I'll just throw this open to the panel, to assume that having a provider in the loop, where the provider, not him or herself necessarily, but generally, we have concerns already about safety, and that they are not trained about how, unlike Devin, who's the sort of, I don't know, he embodies everything, not trained in AI. How do we, is this a good assumption to be making, particularly from a regulatory perspective? I mean, I know that we often think that somehow humans are better, but I think one of our colleagues has said humans are just subpar machines at one point or another. I won't say who that was, but do you have a view on this? Michael, perhaps I'll just start with you.
So unsurprisingly, I mean, my view is that that having a physician in the loop is certainly not a panacea, and it also comes with additional costs. Actually, Professor Flood, I think several years ago, you said something along the lines of this that I'll just repeat and steal, but credit you, so it's not theft. You said, if we are in a situation where we know that the AI is going to make the better decisions, we have that, and we have had a debate in the chat about whether we're there yet, but we are in a case where we know the AI is generally going to make the decisions. What's the point of having, and what we want to do is ensure better accuracy and better efficiency. Isn't the presence of the physician in the loop in that situation not going to add to accuracy, but is going to also undermine efficiency, because you're going to have to pay for that person? And I found your point, to parrot it back to you, rather compelling. That being said, one thing that I was thinking when revisiting the regulations, and the SAMD regulations in particular, I think that given where we are with the tech right now, there is a case to be made for saying, if we do have a closed loop system, we should treat that as class 4 for now. Until we have a better understanding of how it's going to operate, we should give it the highest level of analysis that we can. So what I guess I would say is something along the lines, like what I will say is this explicitly: we cannot take the physician in the loop as automatically going to be an indicia that these problems are going to be solved. Having a physician in the loop over time may actually cause problems without getting any additional benefits. But where we are right now, I think there's a strong case to be made for continuing to keep more autonomous ML presumptively in class 4, unless we can see a reason otherwise.
Okay. Does any do either of you want to comment, or?
I guess the physician in me thinks that I do a good job for the most part. I'm just joking. But no, your point's taken. There's also other complications with having like a boom of technology then funnel through human providers. So for example, alert fatigue is a very real thing. I can tell you all throughout my shift, many things are beeping at me and I don't necessarily respond to them, right? Like I respond to the ones that I know are really important, but there's still many unnecessary beeps and alerts and nudges that come my way. And so you can see how that will, it's a real thing we need to think about. And Michael, you also brought up this idea of automation bias, which is a real thing around humans will sometimes inadvertently give like an unnecessary amount of trust to a technology or an AI system and not think as critically, potentially. So there's a risk there, right? I guess the real question though is how do we mitigate this risk? Like how do we ultimately need to prove that statistically and through research or through deployment and seeing how something is deployed, how do we do that safely and then prove that it actually is doing what you just described, Michael, as it's actually maybe better in this case if it was autonomously acting by itself, and therefore it's better to remove the human from the loop. Like, how does Health Canada allow? It's a bit easier in the hospital space because we're so research oriented to begin with, right? This is what our whole innovation is based off of, doing this in the right way. But in the industry space, how do we enable innovators to do that and then advance this field while like still not having humans in the loop or proving that a human in the loop isn't necessary? I think it's a real struggle, and I'm curious, Marc. I mean, I'm sure you guys have thought a lot about this, but I don't know how you resolve this tension.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and I think one thing, and forgive me for sounding cliche a little bit, it's building trust. I'll be honest, and the best example I can provide is sort of self-driving cars, right? We all don't have Teslas that have this mode, but I'll tell you one thing: my current car that has brake assist and lane keep assist, that feature I needed to trust that feature. So the reason I bring that up is the building of the trust. Transparency is a key aspect here, where we need to inform, we need to inform those physicians about some of the benefits and limitations of these tools. That's where the regulator has ability to help manufacturers with communicating some of those limitations. So you can use this in this particular scenario, or it's been trained in this sort of way. Transparency is key. The FDA had a big panel meeting in mid-October about transparency. And I think the final aspect here is physician in the loop. I agree, there are pros and cons to it. What we care about, or at least what the group should be caring about, are patients, our outcomes. It's not necessarily the AI, it's not necessarily the physician, but it's actually the physician AI team. It's that if we can provide that physician with the tool that can perhaps, and we can demonstrate that outcomes are better with a human and plus AI versus just human, we're all in a better spot. To get there, we need to provide those physicians that tool to build that trust, to demonstrate that outcomes are indeed better. So I think that's key. To Michael's great point about sort of highest level, we should definitely take the highest level of risk class, or assume the worst kind of thing. That's something that we are taking into account when developing policies on this advanced therapeutic product pathway, when in fact, why do we need to classify things at low risk or high risk? Let's look at all adaptive MLMD, make sure that they're operating safely and effectively. So risk classes are at least at this point under consideration for not including, so that we can capture those lower risk products as well and have appropriate oversight on them.
Okay, thank you very much for all your comments. We're coming towards the end of the a lot of time. There are a bunch of interesting questions that we haven't got to. One from Jeremy about what you think is the most novel legal issue in medical negligence and health-related AI. Probably a question for you, Michael, I think. And then another question from Laurie about whether or not privacy laws are impeding AI innovators from being able to, in Canada, from being able to innovate. So maybe I'll just punt those two questions quickly to you, Michael, if you would like to respond. They're kind of big ones, but just a minute for you to respond to those two.
Yeah, and I'd just like to, before I do that, I just want to note for anyone watching the recording, I earlier misspoke about regulatory capture. It's the idea that the regulator will take on the interests of those they are regulated over time. With respect to those two questions, the privacy considerations are very important. Devin already spoke to some of the difficulties collecting data. There's also related concerns about sharing data. So you can collect a variety of data at one location. In some provinces, you can't easily share it with people at another location. This does stifle innovation. What we need to do here, though, is very difficult to figure out because we talked earlier about the data representativeness problem. We can't really address the bias concerns, I think, until we get to a point where we have more representative data sets. And in order to do that, we may need to at least rethink how some of our privacy rules exist, because as of right now, Devin's hospital could collect all the data that it requires, but then won't be able to share it with another hospital, and that's another problem. How to circle the square of ensuring that we protect privacy, but also create representative data sets is a very important question. In the paper on which this talk is based, I talk about the need that we really can't wait to have a whole new data infrastructure to let these things on the market, given how important things are. But things we can do in the meantime are requiring that innovators attend to these risks, explain how they've made attempts to address data representativeness issues, and label. It's an imperfect solution, but it is a problem. I'm going to not speak to the negligence issue because we are out of time, but it is very interesting as well.
Okay. We do like to finish on time, and it is 1 o'clock. I want to first thank Michael for an excellent presentation. Thank you, Michael. I think we all learned a great deal from that. Marc, thank you for being such a good sport and speaking to the issues and helping us understand more about what is happening. And I know that a lot of what is going on at the moment is in flux, and we really, really appreciate your insights and helping us understand this more. Devin, your insights as both an AI innovator and a clinician are just invaluable to helping us think many of these issues through, and thank you so much for doing this. Thank you to Florian and Justine at the team with the AI Plus Society initiative funded by Alex Trebek. Thank you so much. And to all of our participants in the audience, thank you for coming out. Thank you for your questions. If you have more that you'd like to follow up on with us, please reach out to myself or Michael. We'd love to engage with you more as we're learning as we go along as well. I think that's what we're all doing here, and these are great conversations to have. So thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful day here I'm near Kingston. It is absolutely fantastic here today, so I hope wherever you are it is as well, and thanks for coming out. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for the great conversation.